The crystalline halls of the Zephyrian Imperial Palace shimmered with an otherworldly luminescence that made Celia Thorne feel like she was walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The translucent walls seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, responding to the emotional tenor of those within. Right now, they glowed a cold, unwelcoming blue that perfectly matched her mood. Celia adjusted the ceremonial robe she'd been given, the fabric feeling foreign against her skin. The deep purple material was embedded with threads that caught the light, creating patterns that shifted as she moved. Beautiful, certainly, but it felt like wearing a costume for a play she'd never auditioned for. "Ambassador Thorne," came a melodious voice from behind her. Celia turned to see Priestess Lyanna approaching, her pale silver skin marked with the intricate bioluminescent patterns that indicated her high rank among the Zephyrian clergy. "The ceremony will begin shortly. Are you prepared?" "Prepared?" Celia almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. How could anyone be prepared to marry a complete stranger from an alien species as part of a political arrangement that felt more like surrender than diplomacy? "As ready as one can be for such unique circumstances," Celia replied, proud that her voice remained steady. Her years as Earth's cultural attaché had taught her to maintain composure even when her world was crumbling around her. The priestess nodded, her expression sympathetic but resigned. "Prince Kael is a good man, despite the unfortunate nature of this arrangement. The Emperor's decree leaves neither of you with choices, but perhaps you might find common ground." Before Celia could respond, the massive doors to the ceremonial chamber began to open with a sound like singing crystal. The space beyond took her breath away, a vast dome lined with living crystal formations that stretched up toward a ceiling that seemed to disappear into stars. Hundreds of Zephyrian nobles filled tiered seating that spiraled around the central dais, their bioluminescent markings creating a constellation of lights in the dim chamber. At the center of it all stood Prince Kael Varenthis, and despite herself, Celia felt her step falter. He was tall even by Zephyrian standards, his lean frame draped in ceremonial armor that seemed to be carved from a single piece of dark crystal. His skin held the characteristic pale luminescence of his people, but the patterns along his temples and forearms were more intricate than any she'd seen, royal bloodline markers that glowed with soft silver light. What struck her most, however, were his eyes. Where she'd expected cold disdain or barely veiled disgust, she found something entirely different. Prince Kael's violet gaze held a depth of intelligence and what looked almost like apology. The Emperor's voice boomed across the chamber, his words carried by acoustics that made every syllable ring with authority. "Today we witness the binding of Prince Kael Varenthis, third-born of the royal house, to the human representative Celia Thorne. Let this union serve as symbol of the accommodation between our peoples." The way he said accommodation made it clear what he really thought of humanity. Celia felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral as she approached the dais. Each step seemed to echo through the chamber despite the soft-soled ceremonial shoes she wore. When she reached Prince Kael's side, he turned to face her fully. Up close, she could see that his seemingly perfect composure was carefully maintained. There was tension in the line of his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of someone enduring an ordeal rather than celebrating a union. "Celia Thorne of Earth," he said formally, his accent lending a musical quality to her name. "Do you accept this binding as ordained by imperial decree?" The words they'd rehearsed felt hollow in her mouth, but she spoke them clearly. "I accept this binding, Prince Kael Varenthis, as representative of Earth's interests and in the spirit of cooperation between our peoples." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, at her diplomatic phrasing that managed to acknowledge the political nature of their marriage without explicitly accepting subservience. "As do I," he replied, and she caught a subtle emphasis on the word "I" that suggested his own reservations about his father's commands. The binding ceremony itself was mercifully brief. No romantic vows or promises of devotion, just the legal formalities that would register their union in both Zephyrian and Earth databases. Celia felt the cool touch of the ceremonial band as it was placed around her wrist, the metal seeming almost liquid as it conformed to her skin. The matching band on Kael's wrist glowed briefly as some kind of connection was established. By the authority of the Zephyrian Empire and with witness of the noble houses, I declare this binding complete, announced Priestess Lyanna. May it bring stability to both our worlds. The chamber erupted in what might charitably be called applause, though Celia detected undertones of mockery and disapproval from many of the assembled nobles. She maintained her diplomatic smile, even as she wondered what she'd gotten herself into. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Prince Kale moved closer to her side. "We should discuss the practical arrangements," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. Celia nodded, following him through corridors that seemed to twist and curve in ways that defied the palace's external architecture. Their footsteps were muffled by floors that seemed to absorb sound, creating an oddly intimate atmosphere despite the grand scale of their surroundings. "These will be your quarters," Kale said, stopping before an archway that led to a suite of rooms decorated in warm amber tones, a stark contrast to the cool blues and silvers that dominated the rest of the palace. "I trust you'll find them comfortable." "And you?" Celia asked, genuinely curious about the sleeping arrangements. "My chambers are in the eastern wing," he replied, confirming what she'd already suspected. "This arrangement is political, not personal. We need not pretend otherwise in private." His words should have been reassuring, but something about his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Celia studied his profile as he gazed out through the transparent walls toward the city beyond. "Prince Kale," she said carefully, "may I speak freely?" He turned to her, those violet eyes focusing intently on her face. "I suspect you will regardless of my permission." Earth diplomats seem to value directness. Was that almost a smile? "This situation is unprecedented for both of us. I propose we approach it as adults. No deception, no games. We both have duties to our peoples, but perhaps we can make this arrangement bearable." For a long moment, he was silent. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Acceptable terms, Ambassador Thorn. Though I would add one condition." "Which is?" "When we are alone, you may call me Kale. Titles are for the court's benefit, not ours." Celia felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Then you should call me Celia. Ambassador Thorn makes this feel even more like a business transaction." "Very well. Celia." Her name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow. "There are palace protocols you'll need to learn, areas that are restricted, customs that must be observed. I can arrange for instruction." "I'd appreciate that." "And Kale?" She waited until he looked at her directly. "Thank you. For not making this harder than it already is." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the formal facade he'd maintained throughout the ceremony. "The situation is not of your choosing any more than it is mine. My father's methods are, often heavy-handed." It was the closest thing to criticism of the Emperor she'd heard from any Zephyrian, and it told her more about Prince Kale's character than hours of formal conversation might have. As she settled into her new quarters that evening, Celia found herself thinking not about the impossibility of her situation, but about the moment when her new husband had looked at her with something approaching respect. Perhaps this arrangement wouldn't be the disaster she'd feared. In his own chambers across the palace, Prince Kale stared out at the three moons rising over his city and wondered why the human diplomat's direct gaze had stayed with him long after their conversation ended. This was meant to be a temporary inconvenience, nothing more. So why did he find himself hoping their next encounter would come soon? The industrial district of Lumenspire City bore little resemblance to the gleaming spires of the upper levels. Here, beneath the city's crystalline beauty, massive foundries and processing plants churned out the materials that kept the Zephyrian Empire running. The air tasted of metal and ozone, and the constant hum of machinery created a rhythm that Jenna Cross had grown to find oddly comforting over the past 6 months. She adjusted her protective gear and ran another diagnostic on the atmospheric processor she'd been assigned to maintain. The Zephyrian technology was elegant in its complexity, but it had never been designed with human physiology in mind. Every day brought new challenges as she and the other Earth engineers worked to adapt systems that seemed almost alive in their responsiveness. Cross, you're needed in Section 7, called Supervisor Mal then, his bioluminescent markings flickering with irritation. The Zephyrian overseer had made no secret of his disdain for the human workers who'd been assigned to his facility as part of the recent trade agreements. The gravity stabilizers are malfunctioning again. Jenna nodded and gathered her tools, ignoring the supervisor's tone. She'd learned that responding to prejudice with competence was more effective than confrontation, even if it was sometimes harder on her pride. Section 7 housed the facility's most dangerous equipment, quantum field generators that could destabilize if not properly maintained. As Jenna approached the malfunctioning unit, she noticed something that made her pause. The diagnostic readings didn't match what she'd expect from a simple malfunction. The patterns looked almost deliberate. Interesting problem. Jenna spun around to find a Zephyrian male watching her work. Unlike the industrial workers around them, he wore the deep blue uniform that marked him as military, though his rank insignia was unfamiliar to her. What struck her most was the genuine curiosity in his violet eyes rather than the dismissive indifference she'd grown accustomed to. Captain Darian Voss, he introduced himself with a slight bow that seemed more respectful than perfunctory. I'm conducting a routine security inspection of the facility. Jenna Cross, atmospheric systems engineer, she replied, surprised by his courteous manner. And yes, it's quite interesting. These aren't random failures, someone's been very clever about making sabotage look like equipment fatigue. Captain Voss moved closer, studying the diagnostic display over her shoulder. She caught the faint scent of something like ozone and starlight that seemed to be his natural fragrance. You can tell the difference? The patterns are wrong, Jenna explained, pulling up comparative data on her portable unit. Natural equipment failure follows predictable stress patterns. This. She highlighted several anomalies. This suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Zephyrian technology but an understanding of human safety protocols. Meaning whoever did this wanted to cause problems without actually killing anyone. The failures are designed to shut down operations, not cause catastrophic explosions. Darian was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. That's a very detailed analysis, Engineer Cross. You seem quite familiar with both Zephyrian and human systems. Something in his tone made Jenna look at him more carefully. There was an undercurrent to his words that suggested this conversation was about more than equipment maintenance. It's my job to understand how different technologies interact, Captain. Especially when lives depend on it. Indeed. He paused, then seemed to come to some decision. Walk with me, if you would. I'd like to show you something. Jenna hesitated. Fraternizing with Zephyrian military officers wasn't explicitly forbidden, but it wasn't encouraged either. Still, something about Captain Voss seemed different from the other Zephyrians she'd encountered, less rigid, more genuinely interested in her perspectives. He led her through sections of the facility she'd never seen before, past equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. The deeper they went, the more she noticed signs of recent construction and modifications that hadn't been in the original facility schematics. Tell me, Engineer Cross, Darian said as they walked, what do you think of the working conditions here for your people? The question was so direct it caught her off guard. I think, we're grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the partnership between our species, she replied carefully, giving the diplomatic answer she'd been coached to provide. That's what you're supposed to say, he observed. What do you actually think? Jenna stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Are you asking me to criticize the Empire, Captain? Because that seems like a dangerous conversation for both of us. Perhaps, he acknowledged. But I find myself increasingly interested in dangerous conversations lately. There was something in his voice, a weariness, maybe, or disillusionment, that made her decide to trust him, at least partially. The conditions are challenging. The equipment wasn't designed for human physiology, the hours are long, and the safety protocols don't always account for our different tolerances. But we adapt. You shouldn't have to, Darian said quietly. Adaptation implies that the current system is acceptable, merely requiring adjustment. What if the system itself is flawed? Jenna stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. Captain Voss, are you questioning the wisdom of policies that treat sentient beings as expendable resources? Yes, I suppose I am. He stopped in front of a sealed doorway and placed his palm against a biometric scanner. What I'm about to show you is classified, but I believe you have a right to know what's being built here. The door slid open to reveal a chamber filled with equipment Jenna had never seen before. It looked like a combination of laboratory and manufacturing facility, with human-made components integrated alongside Zephyrian technology in ways that seemed almost organic. What is this place? She whispered. Officially, experimental integration research. Unofficially, Darian's expression darkened. A testing ground for biological compatibility studies. The Empire is very interested in understanding human physiology, particularly our reproductive capabilities and genetic adaptability. The implications hit Jenna like a physical blow. They're studying us. Not working with us, studying us like specimens. Some members of the High Council view the recent marriage between Prince Kale and the human diplomat as more than political theater. They see it as the first step in a broader experiment. Darian moved to one of the workstations and activated a holographic display showing complex genetic sequencing data. This facility is where they plan to analyze any offspring from that union. Jenna felt sick. That's monstrous. Yes, Darian agreed simply. It is. Why are you showing me this? Why risk telling me? Darian turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken, not fear, but something warmer and more complex. Because I've spent the last month watching you work, watching how you treat your fellow humans and even the Zephyrians who show you nothing but contempt. You have integrity, Jenna Cross. And because I've realized I can no longer be complicit in policies I find morally reprehensible. The way he said her name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool air in the chamber. What are you suggesting, Captain? That there are others who feel as I do. Zephyrians who believe our empire has lost its way, who think the partnership with Earth should be built on equality rather than exploitation. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the complex patterns of silver light that traced along his temples. And that changes rarely happen from within established power structures. You're talking about rebellion. I'm talking about justice. They stood there in the humming silence of the secret laboratory, two beings from different worlds who'd found themselves on the same side of a moral divide. Jenna became acutely aware of Darian's proximity, of the way his violet eyes seemed to see into her thoughts. This is insane, she said softly. If we're caught, we'll be executed for treason, Darian finished. I'm aware of the risks. Then why? Because some things are worth the risk. His hand moved to touch her face, fingers tracing along her cheek with surprising gentleness. Because I've discovered that my conscience matters more than my rank. And because, she prompted, her voice barely a whisper. Because somewhere in the process of watching you work, of seeing your strength and compassion, I've fallen in love with you, Jenna Cross. And I refuse to stand by while my people treat yours as experimental subjects. The confession hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond personal feelings. Jenna felt her heart racing as she looked into his face, seeing sincerity and vulnerability beneath his military bearing. Darian, she began, then stopped. What could she say? That she felt the same way. That over the past weeks she'd found herself looking forward to his inspection visits, hoping for glimpses of the thoughtful man beneath the officer's uniform. Instead of words, she reached up to touch his hand where it rested against her cheek. If we do this, if we really try to change things, there's no going back. I know. We could lose everything. We already have, if we continue as we are. The only question is whether we lose it passively or fighting for something better. Jenna made her decision. Rising on her toes, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of rebellion and hope. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we find the others. The Zephyrians who still believe in honor, the humans who refuse to accept subjugation." Darian's eyes blazed with determination. "We build a resistance." Over the following weeks, they began carefully reaching out to potential allies. Darian used his military access to identify Zephyrians who'd expressed doubts about current policies, while Jenna connected with human workers who'd witnessed the growing exploitation firsthand. Their relationship deepened alongside their rebellion. Stolen moments in maintenance corridors became planning sessions punctuated by increasingly passionate kisses. Secret meetings in unused sections of the facility provided cover for both revolutionary plotting and intimate conversations that revealed how much they'd come to mean to each other. "My father would disown me if he knew," Darian confessed one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports in a hidden alcove. "A military family going back 12 generations, and I'm planning to overthrow everything they've served." "Are you having second thoughts?" Jenna asked, though she hoped desperately that he wasn't. "About the rebellion?" "Never." He pulled her closer, until she was sitting between his legs with her back against his chest. "About you?" "Also never. You've shown me what it means to choose love over duty, conscience over convenience. The Empire won't give up without a fight," she warned. "When this starts, people will die." "People are already dying, Jenna. Just more quietly." His arms tightened around her. "At least this way, they'll die fighting for something better." As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their hiding place. They froze, holding their breath until the sounds faded. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Darian whispered. "I've heard rumors that Minister Yorick is planning to expand the experimental programs. More facilities, more human subjects." Jenna turned in his arms to face him. "How long do we have?" "Days, maybe a week. Then we'd better hope our people are ready." "Are you ready?" he asked, studying her face in the dim light. Jenna thought of the humans laboring under increasingly harsh conditions, of the secret laboratories and genetic experiments, of the prince and diplomat whose marriage had become a symbol of everything wrong with the current system. Then she thought of Darian's courage in risking everything for justice, and her own growing love for this remarkable man who'd chosen honor over safety. "I'm ready," she said, and sealed her commitment with a kiss that promised both revolution and forever. The ancient archives beneath the Zephyrian capital existed in a perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the soft bioluminescence of fungal formations that had grown undisturbed for millennia. Tessa Morgan adjusted her portable light and carefully photographed another section of wall carvings, her xenoarchaeology training helping her recognize patterns that others might dismiss as mere decoration. "Fascinating technique," came a melodious voice from the shadows. Tessa turned to see a Zephyrian female emerging from behind a massive stone pillar, her pale skin marked with the intricate patterns that indicated scholarly rank. "You're documenting the photoglyphic sequences rather than just the surface imagery." Dr. Tessa Morgan, xenobiologist and archaeological consultant, Tessa introduced herself, intrigued by meeting another researcher in these forgotten depths. "And you are?" "Researcher Maven Astridis, specializing in pre-imperial Zephyrian linguistics." The woman moved closer, her violet eyes bright with scholarly enthusiasm. "I've been studying these archives for 3 cycles, but I confess your human perspective brings fresh insights to patterns I may have overlooked." Tessa smiled, pleased to encounter a Zephyrian who seemed genuinely interested in collaboration rather than merely tolerating human presence. "Fresh eyes often see what familiar ones miss. What brought you down here originally?" Maven gestured toward a series of carved panels that seemed to tell a story in flowing, interconnected symbols. "I've been researching the origins of the Zephyrian language, particularly the root words that don't seem to have evolved from our known ancestral dialects. There are linguistic anomalies that suggest." She paused, as if uncertain whether to continue. "That suggest what?" Tessa prompted gently. That our people may not have always been the isolated species our histories claim. Maven moved to activate a holographic display that projected enlarged versions of the carvings. These symbols here, for instance, they don't match any known Zephyrian script, yet they're integrated seamlessly with texts that are clearly our ancestral language. Tessa studied the projections with growing excitement. Maven, may I show you something? She activated her own portable scanner and pulled up genetic sequencing data she'd been analyzing. I've been studying biological samples from both our species for my research on atmospheric compatibility. Look at these protein sequences. The data streams floated between them in shimmering holographic detail. Maven's breath caught as she recognized the implications immediately. These base sequences, they're nearly identical, Maven whispered. Not similar, identical in several key genetic markers. Which should be impossible for two species that evolved on different worlds with no historical contact, Tessa finished. Unless we didn't evolve separately. Maven's voice was barely audible. Tessa, if this data is accurate, if these carvings mean what I think they mean, then everything both our peoples believe about our origins is wrong. They stared at each other across the holographic displays, the weight of their discovery settling between them like a living thing. Tessa felt her pulse quicken, and not just from scientific excitement. There was something about Maven's intensity, the way her eyes blazed with intellectual passion, that stirred feelings she hadn't expected to develop for anyone, let alone a Zephyrian. We need more evidence, Maven said finally. These findings are too important to risk being dismissed as speculation. Agreed. What do you know about the deeper archive levels? Maven's expression grew thoughtful. There are sealed chambers that haven't been opened in centuries. High Priestess Narita mentioned them once, areas that were closed by imperial order during the early expansion period. Can you get us access? Perhaps. Narita has always been interested in historical accuracy over political convenience. If we approach her correctly. Maven trailed off, studying Tessa's face. This could be dangerous, you realize. If we're right, this information challenges the fundamental premise of Zephyrian superiority that drives imperial policy. And it challenges Earth's assumption that we're facing a completely alien intelligence, Tessa added. Both our governments have built their relationship on the idea that we're utterly different species. When we may actually be, what? Cousins? Siblings separated by some ancient diaspora? The implications were staggering. Tessa moved closer to Maven, drawn by the other woman's brilliant mind and the courage it was taking for her to even consider pursuing this research. Maven, she said softly, are you prepared for what this might mean? For how it could change everything? Are you? Maven countered, but her voice was gentle rather than challenging. They were standing very close now, close enough that Tessa could see the complex patterns of silver light that traced along Maven's temples, could catch the faint scent of something like jasmine and starlight that seemed to be her natural fragrance. I think, Tessa said carefully, that truth is worth the risk. Even if it upends everything we thought we knew. Even if it makes us both traitors to our respective species. Especially then. Maven reached out to touch Tessa's hand, her skin surprisingly warm despite its pale luminescence. Then we're in agreement. We pursue this research wherever it leads. 3 days later, they stood before High Priestess Narita in the ancient Temple of Memory, surrounded by crystalline formations that seemed to record and replay fragments of conversation from across the centuries. The elderly Zephyrian's eyes were sharp despite her advanced age, and she listened to their request with growing fascination. You wish to access the forbidden archives, she said finally. Chambers that have been sealed for 800 cycles by imperial decree. We believe they contain information crucial to understanding the true relationship between our species, Maven explained. Information that could change the course of current events. Narita studied them both carefully. And you, human scholar, what do you hope to gain from this knowledge? Understanding, Tessa replied honestly. My people and yours are stumbling toward either greater cooperation or devastating conflict, largely because we don't truly comprehend our connection to each other. Show me your evidence. For the next 2 hours, they presented their findings, genetic data, linguistic analysis, archaeological interpretations, and the strange resonances they discovered between human and Zephyrian biological systems. Narita listened without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed a depth of knowledge Tessa hadn't expected. Remarkable, the High Priestess said when they finished. And terrifying in its implications. She stood slowly, moving to a section of the temple wall that appeared blank. What you're suggesting aligns with certain, restricted texts that have been preserved by the religious orders. She pressed her palm against the wall, and hidden panels slid aside to reveal a passage leading deeper into the temple complex. I will grant you access, Narita announced. But know that this knowledge comes with a price. Once learned, it cannot be unlearned. Once spoken, it cannot be taken back. The forbidden archives were unlike anything either scholar had ever seen. Instead of carved stone or holographic displays, the walls themselves seemed to be made of some crystalline substance that stored information in three-dimensional matrices. When activated, entire sections would light up with complex data streams that told stories spanning millennia. By the stars, Maven breathed as they activated the first chamber. Tessa, look at this. The walls came alive with images, not static carvings but moving records of events from the distant past. They showed beings that looked like a hybrid between humans and Zephyrians, with the luminescent skin of one species but the varied coloring and features of the other. The precursors, Tessa whispered, recognizing them from theoretical xenoarchaeological studies. The parent species that was supposed to be mythical. Not mythical, Maven corrected, her voice filled with wonder and horror. Extinct. Look. The images showed a great catastrophe, stellar collapse, massive evacuations, desperate attempts to preserve their civilization by seeding their genetic legacy across distant worlds. Some ships went to a blue-green world that would become Earth. Others traveled to the crystal-rich planet that became Zephyros. Both groups lost contact with their origins and, over millions of years, adapted to their new environments until they became distinct species. We're the same people, Maven said, tears streaming down her face. Separated by space and time, evolved along different paths, but originally the same people. And we've been treating each other as aliens, Tessa added, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Fighting over resources and territory when we should be celebrating a reunion millions of years in the making. They stood in the chamber surrounded by the evidence of their shared heritage, and suddenly the distance between them seemed both infinitely vast and completely irrelevant. Maven turned to Tessa, her expression raw with feeling. What do we do now? She asked. How do we tell two civilizations that everything they believe about themselves is wrong? Instead of answering immediately, Tessa stepped closer and took Maven's hands in hers. We start with the truth between us, she said softly. Maven, these past weeks working with you, discovering these incredible things together. I need you to know that I've fallen in love with you. Not despite our differences, but because of what we share. Maven's eyes widened, then filled with a joy that made her luminescent markings pulse with warm light. Tessa, I was afraid to hope, but yes, I feel the same. You've shown me wonders I never imagined, challenged me to think beyond the boundaries I was taught. I love your brilliant mind, your courage, your determination to seek truth regardless of consequences. They kissed there among the ancient records, two women from different worlds discovering that love, like genetic heritage, transcends the artificial boundaries created by distance and time. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. The knowledge we've discovered, Maven said, it's going to change everything. The political implications alone. The marriage between Prince Kale and the human diplomat, Tessa realized. It's not just a political alliance, it's a homecoming. The reunion of two branches of the same family tree. And the resistance movements on both sides, the fear and prejudice, the exploitation. Maven's expression grew determined. We have to share this information, Tessa. Our people deserve to know the truth. It won't be easy. Governments on both sides have too much invested in the current power structures. Then we bypass the governments, Maven said firmly. We go directly to the people. Scientists, scholars, anyone willing to listen to evidence over propaganda. They spent the rest of the night documenting everything they'd found, creating copies of the most crucial data and planning how to disseminate it safely. As dawn approached, they prepared to return to the surface with knowledge that would either unite their peoples or get them both killed for heresy. No matter what happens, Tessa said as they sealed the archive chamber behind them, I want you to know that finding you, loving you, discovering this truth together, it's been worth any risk. Maven kissed her again, soft and sweet in the growing light. Then let's go change the world, my love. As they emerged from the depths carrying the secret of their shared origins, neither knew that above them, revolution was already beginning. The resistance networks that Jenna and Darian had been building were preparing to act, while in the palace, Celia was discovering that her marriage to Prince Kael had become something far more than a political arrangement. The truth they carried would either be the key to ending centuries of artificial division, or the final catalyst that tore two civilizations apart. But as they walked hand in hand toward an uncertain future, Tessa and Maven knew that some discoveries were worth any price, especially when they led not just to knowledge, but to love.